are now live with the final season 1 episode of Narrative Worlds and my fabulous guest, Melinda Lowe, who I will introduce in a minute. I want to thank you for being here. I'm your host, Kate Elliott. I love saying that. The goal of this series is to dig into the idea of narrative worlds and the theory and practice of building them. So each month, a guest joins me for a dialogue on a specific aspect of world building. We'll talk for about 40 minutes and there'll be space for questions at the end of the hour. I'll close the hour. Well, I won't close the hour by mentioning forthcoming dates because this is the end of season 1 and we'll be off for the summer. There's a ask the question button at the bottom center. Use that. If you have a question, I won't be looking at chat. Standard disclaimer, this series is not about a goal. It is not a lesson. It is just two professionals talking about their own thoughts and their experiences about writing craft and world building. There's no right answer. There's no secret handshake. Sorry. If you hear something that's useful to you, that's fantastic. And if not, thank you for joining us. That's great too. So today, I have Malinda Lo with me from the East Coast. Melinda is the critically acclaimed and best-selling author of several young adult novels, including most recently the fabulous Last Night at the Telegraph Club, which I have to mention because I think this is amazing, received 8-starred trade journal reviews and deserved every one. Her debut novel, Ash, was a lesbian retelling of Cinderella. It was a finalist for the William C. Morris YA Debut Award, the Andre Norton Award for YA Science Fiction Fantasy, the Mythopoeic Fantasy Award, and was a Kirkus Best Book for Children and Teens. She's been a 3-time finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and her short fiction and nonfiction has been published in numerous places. Melinda, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to talk to you. I get to see you
on
screen at least. It's amazing.
It's like the past year. When I say last year, I mean 2019.
Yeah. It's been so long since I have seen people in reality, like publishing people, author friends. Like it's funny. Like I've missed those events and traveling to see people for book stuff so much. It's just been a long time.
I like hanging out with
you here.
I know. So thank you. And I asked you if you wanted to come talk about world building and about research, partly because Last Night at the Telegraph Club is set in the 1950s and you had to do a ton of research on the 1950s Chinatown and the lesbian and gay scene and all the things that went with that, but also because research can be used to world build secondary world fantasies or any world, whether it's set in the real world or the other world. And but before we drop into research, I wanted to quickly ask you if you could share your philosophy of world building. I like hearing different people like and it can be anything. God. Yeah, sorry.
This is a hard question. Okay, my philosophy of world building, I guess, is that you should approach world building thoughtfully and probably with humility, and not go into it believing that you already know how things work. That is something I have learned over many books. I do not know how things work unless I open myself up to reading scholarship on it from people who have thought way more about a specific subject than I have, because we go into a lot of fiction kind of believing, well, we go through life, right? Assuming that we know things about the way the world works. And I think that can really trip you up as a writer and with world building. You can make assumptions about why people make certain choices, and those assumptions may or may not be correct. And the only way you learn whether your assumptions are correct and then whether or not you want to push back against those assumptions is to be open to learning that you were mistaken, and learning what people who have spent many more years studying these subjects than you have concluded.
This reminds me of the scholar Elizabeth Barber, who is a scholar of textiles, and especially the history of textiles and prehistoric textiles. And in her book, like called Women's Work, like the first 40,000 years. I know, right?
Short time period.
Short time period.
Very focused.
But you know that there was a lot of it going on. And I think it's her. I think she's the one who mentions this story, but she's talking about how the archaeologists were digging up these Neolithic and later late Stone Age, maybe early Bronze Age places. And they would find these rooms that they would have all these little stones in them with holes in them. And they couldn't, why were all these little stones with little holes in them? Was this a religious room? What symbolism was this? And they came up with every single possible idea about what these might be, except for what they turned out actually to be, which they couldn't process in their heads because of their assumptions. They were loom weights.
Oh, fascinating.
But they couldn't see it. They couldn't see it because of they lacked humility, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, so much of archaeology is about, excavating bones and making assumptions about graves, mostly assumptions that they were all men, and then realizing 20, 30 years down the road that this warrior that you thought was a man was a woman. So these are things that really, they really trip people up. So.
And in a way, aren't we excavating? I mean, I could make a metaphor that says that I often feel with the first draft that I'm excavating the story. I know what I think is going to be there. But I also discover things, and I can't discover the best things if I am sure of what they already are. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally see that. And I would like to hope that my first drafts are directed, but I think that they are not directed as much as I would like. And I definitely can see that excavating as a really good metaphor for figuring out what story you're telling.
I mean, I know where I'm going, and I often know like the main things going into it, but what I've learned is that I have to give myself space to excavate, mm-hmm. even though I go off topic or that I write too much, because that's me learning. And, mm-hmm. and like you said, figuring out what we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great when there's something that you actually don't know, and that other people also don't know, because that's where you can make it up. I love that part. I mean, you can make up things about the real world, but I am a terrible. I guess I'm stuck, because I feel like once I find out a fact, if it is accepted as fact and it feels real, I cannot. It's very hard for me to go against it fictionally. But if you don't know what something does, or if there's a hole in the research and you can expand on it with your imagination, I love that.
So you're saying that, unlike me, you didn't read those kind of, excuse my language, crackpot books of, strange symbolism in the ancient world, when people like spin these bizarre ideas about stuff. I think
I have some of those on my bookshelf. Yes.
I love those, not because I believed them, but because they gave me a window into trying to look at things in a different way.
Oh no, I love those too. I think what I mean is that when I'm writing fantasy or science fiction, absolutely, I can go off in lots of directions, but recently I've been writing historical fiction, so it feels more like I'm stuck to the historical narrative.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's talk then a little bit about, well, not a little bit. I'm going to throw two questions at you, and you can answer them in whatever order, or answer a different question as you please. Why is research important? God, I can't talk. Why is research important? And then a walkthrough in detail from what I call basic to advanced research process. Because I think sometimes a lot of people know how to research, but I think some people are not so sure how they can get from that place of complete, like, I know nothing about this. I have the process I use, but I want to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Yeah.
with your several advanced degrees.
Yeah, this is the sad thing. I thought I was going to be an anthropologist, so I went to get a PhD in anthropology. I left grad school after 4 years because I hated grad school, but I loved research, and I really did learn how to do research there. And I've already forgotten the first part of your question, but I can.
Let's talk about research. Let's
Okay,
talk about the process of
the
let's just
process.
assume research is important because that's how you
Oh, why it's important?
well,
Well,
yeah.
okay. Well, there are many reasons I think research is important. For me, I find it important because it helps me to understand the characters.
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone gets this, but I feel like I cannot understand a character until I know what world they live in.
Yeah.
Like I need to know where they I need to know who their parents were, but I also need to know like what their parents did for a living, what class system they live in, the kinds of neighborhood they lived in, what food they eat, you know, do they need are they struggling for money to buy food? You know, I need to know a lot of things about how their world works. I need to know how other people perceive them in that world when they're walking on the street. So I need to know what kinds of opportunities they have in their lives. You know, what kinds of opportunities are shut off for them because of who they are. And I feel like I get to know that through research. And if I'm writing about a character who is not exactly like me, which is pretty much all the time, then I need to know what people who are like my character experienced. That really helps me to create a new character, kind of by stealing from real people's lives. So that is very helpful for me in terms of character building.
Yeah, I call that. Yeah, I'm exactly the same way. I can't write
Of
a
course.
character. Yeah, I know. Well, we already buy the same clothes at at REI, right?
Yes,
The
I
same
bet we do.
sweater, the same smart wool sweater.
I love smart wool.
They're the best. But yeah, I mean, who a character to me can't be pulled apart from who they are in the world and how they perceive the world around them, just as we can't. We can't, you know. So walk me through, not me, but everybody listening, walk through the basic through advanced research process that you use.
Sure. Well, maybe let me actually use the example of Last Night at the Telegraph Club, because when I started writing this novel, I knew nothing about the 1950s except for what we know in popular culture. Like I associated it with Leave It to Beaver. Okay, so I knew very little about that time. And one of the reasons that I was interested in writing about that time was because I had read this book called Wide Open Town, A History of Queer San Francisco to 1965. So it's pre-1965 San Francisco queer history. And I was reading it and there was literally one line. I don't know if it was in a footnote or just at the end of a paragraph. And it said, Merle Wu, who was an Asian American lesbian in the community, said that lesbians of color used to go to the Forbidden City nightclub. That's it. That was one line in that entire book. And I was like, oh, look, lesbians of color are going to a Chinatown nightclub. That is fascinating. You know, and I was like, I want to know more about this. So there was nothing more in that book. There was a footnote at the end of that paragraph. I looked at the footnote. It footnoted the interview that the author, who was a historian, had done with Merle Wu. The interview had not been transcribed. It was in an archive in San Francisco. So I was like, all right, I know I used to live in San Francisco, but at the time that I was reading this, I did not live there. I now live in Massachusetts. So I couldn't exactly just go to the archive and like look at this interview. So what I had to do was, when I decided to write this story, I had to do a lot of things. I had to think about what was it like to be a Chinese American lesbian in San Francisco in the 1950s, which is a lot of things packed into one sentence that are very hard to find because there is very little research on that. Most of that research shows up in those one-liners, like in Wide Open Town, with a footnote. So what I did was I kind of started from a very wide lens. The 1950s. What were the 1950s like? I literally got a book called The 1950s. And I read a lot of it. I think I read a Wikipedia article or two about the 1950s just to like get a general idea of what that decade was like, what historians now believe were the general themes of that decade, like what was going on at the time. So I also went general in terms of geography. What was it like in California in the 1950s?
Right, right.
And because geographically, different regions have different experiences. Then I could narrow it down to when you're reading these broad histories, they're often very mainstream at first and they don't have detailed footnotes, but they do often have endnotes, and you can go to the endnotes and see what they reference. And in that way, you can zoom in closer and closer to the subject you're interested in. So from 1950s and California, I would zoom into San Francisco. I could read about LGBT history in the mid-century more broadly. And from there, I could look for little mentions of Asian Americans and women. Not too many, but I could look there. And so I spent, honestly, in these broad texts, I spent a lot of time reading the endnotes and the footnotes to see where these writers got their sources. And then
Can I hold on? Can I make a quick commentary too about, because that time reading the general is never wasted, because that's like tending your garden. Now your garden has stuff that later you don't have to come back to and say, well, what did that mean? But because you read it in the general.
Yeah, like I didn't even know I knew vaguely the Korean War happened in the 1950s, but I didn't know like how that was when I didn't know when specifically, and I didn't know how that affected policy toward Asian Americans in the United States. And I wouldn't have known to think about that had I not read the broad general 1950s history where they talk about wars. And that also led me to researching McCarthyism, which I knew existed, but was never something that I thought specifically about. How does that affect life as a Chinese American or as an LGBT American in the 1950s, which it did, and it had specific effects on them. So those broad histories really do point you in the direction of where to look for more specific sources. So then I would go find the specific sources. And I have the advantage of having gone to grad school at several graduate institutions. I have alumni access to their library systems online. So this is what I do. So I would go to the online alumni resources and read like scholarly articles on this stuff. I mean, I got used to doing that in grad school, and it can be dry, but there are a lot of academics who have done really detailed research into extremely obscure topics, and it's all there for you to find if you know where to look, So I would look on JSTOR, which everybody should know what JSTOR is if they're doing research. It's an online database of academic articles. So you can find a lot of stuff on there and go through them. And also, again, look through the footnotes. I spend a lot of time reading footnotes. So once I've done a lot of this reading, and I feel like I have a grasp on the general shape of the period or the subject that I'm researching, then I know where there are holes. Like, you don't know where the holes are at the beginning. You have to do quite a bit of research before you know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And once you know what you don't know, then you can figure out ways to find out. And what I did was contact historians who had written about adjacent subjects and ask them for direction in terms of whether there was a source I should look up or whether there was someone I should speak to, because I realized at the time, this cannot happen for everything, but because I was writing a book set in the 50s, people who lived in the 50s are still alive. And, there was very little academic scholarship on Chinese American lesbians in the 1950s. Basically, there was none, but I knew that Chinese American lesbians were alive in the 1950s. And because I am Asian American, I am queer, and I used to live in San Francisco, I did have a connection to that community. So I emailed someone who was also a queer Asian American scholar who I knew on Twitter. Okay. And because they had tweeted
Yeah.
me a couple times. And so I emailed them. I looked them up and emailed them and said, I'm writing this book. Do you know who I should talk to? And they connected me with a historian at SF State, San Francisco State. And that historian, Amy Sueyoshi, was extremely helpful and put me in touch with two Chinese American lesbians who had grown up in San Francisco in the 50s and 60s. And I ended up then going to San Francisco, where I met one of them in Chinatown, Crystal Zhang, who was so wonderful. She's now in her 70s. And we walked all around Chinatown together. She told me about growing up there. It was amazing. I mean, this
That's
is what
amazing.
anthropology is. Okay,
Yes.
this is,
Yeah.
you find an informant and you get them to tell you about their lives. And so I actually feel like I made very good use of my anthropology training here, because I knew I needed to find an informant who could tell me what it was like for her. And so I spoke to her, and while I was in San Francisco, of course, I did go to the archive and I listened to that interview that was in that footnote. And and interestingly, that was one of the few interviews from that research project that were not transcribed. So I listened to it and I took notes, and that was also very interesting. And so I also visited archives in San Francisco to look at the yearbooks of the high school that's in Last Night at the Telegraph Club.
Yeah.
They had them at the San Francisco History Center and the public library there. So that was really fun. So I think that talking to people and doing archival research is really at the end of your research game. Like, you need to precede that with a lot of reading on your own so that you have an idea of the specific questions to ask people, because people have full lives and you can't really expect them to give you like a 101 level. You need to be asking people specific questions by the time you're talking to actual people. So that should be at the end of
That's it. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that in quite that way, but it's quite right that, there's a lot of talk about using sensitivity readers, but sensitivity readers shouldn't be your first line. They should come after you.
No, and this is not the same as a sensitivity reader.
I know that. I know that. But I think sometimes people use, I don't know, perhaps, but it's just, but it's important not to ask someone to educate you, but to educate yourself as far as you can through research, because even if, for example, you don't I can get JSTOR articles because my sister has access. So I'll just, email her and say, hey, could you get me this article? And then, a couple of days later, there it shows up. Not everyone has that option.
Right.
Some people will have the option of having a nearby university library.
Yeah.
And oftentimes community, and public libraries.
Community libraries and public libraries also have a ton of access to these databases. I think people don't realize that.
Yeah.
Like, your public library can get you a lot of stuff. I did a lot of research through the San Francisco Public Library. And also, I will say some research libraries, like I went to the Schlesinger Institute, which is at what used to be Radcliffe at Harvard, to look at I looked at 17 magazines, the magazine 17 from 1950 to 1955, because I wanted to see what teenage girls what they were selling to teenage girls at the time and what they were interested in. And the Radcliffe Institute and the Schlesinger Library, intriguingly, are open to the public. So anybody who wants to go to the Schlesinger Library to research there can. You just have to write to the librarians and ask for a time. And that is where I learned.
Why. Yeah.
And explain why. And that is where I learned, intriguingly, Arthur C. Clarke had written a column for 17 magazine in the 1950s about space exploration, with the goal of getting teenage girls to want to be involved in STEM.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So I had no idea that this existed.
Fascinating.
Isn't it? It's amazing.
Well, amazing. that's the other thing. The thing that I actually love most about research, besides the fact just that I'm curious, I'm just curious about the world. The world is amazing. History is amazing. All the things people have done is just mind boggling to me. But also, I discover the most amazing things that I just
Yeah.
would never have thought to even, again, it gets back to this idea of questions. I would never have thought to ask, did Arthur C. Clarke write a space column for 17 magazine in the 50s for girls? I wouldn't have, and yet there it is.
Yeah. It's amazing to find that stuff. And I think that that is what makes research so fun, like you were saying. And also, that's something I didn't expect, right? Like, I expected that girls would not be encouraged to do space science
Yeah.
in the 1950s. But 17 magazine actually, I mean, they had fashion articles, they had articles about talking to your boyfriend, but they also had articles about Jackie Cochran, who was one of the first women pilots, who was really, she was really into flight. She started the Waves, I think, or the Wasps. She was involved in that. She was really a celebrity pilot at the time, and they interviewed her about her career. And this Arthur C. Clarke column was just amazing. I mean, there were several of them. It was a whole year of columns by him, and it was just, it was so fascinating. There was a lot of science stuff in 17 magazine. So you think I had assumptions, you know, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Well, and the richness, to me, the richness of world building comes whether the story is set, it's a historical or a secondary world, is when, as the writer, you can find those things that don't run straight down that path of assumptions, and you can add that thing in that's kind of, it seems out of left field, but once it's incorporated, it feels like it's always been there.
yeah, yeah, it was really fascinating to learn that stuff. And I also learned through research that you know, the Girl Scouts, there was a thing called the Wing Scouts in the 40s and 50s, which was Girl Scouts for girls who wanted to fly airplanes. And they would literally take girls up in airplanes to show them how they worked. Like, this was a real thing because people were very into the atomic age and flight, and at the time, and they were certainly trying to get girls involved. It was, I did not know this, but it's fascinating. I mean, I don't, maybe there are
Yeah.
programs like that now, but I had no idea that would have existed in the 1940s and 50s.
Well, it reminds me a lot of when people would say things like, well, why write women in medieval stories, because they were all, just pregnant, illiterate peasant women who never went more than 5 miles from their little village, right? Except, of course, that isn't at all what the lives of women were like. But if you think it is, you can't write about anything beyond that really narrow range. Like the Wing
Exactly.
Scouts, I never knew. This is all new information to me too, right? But and yet, I did for example, Crown of Stars, my big 7-volume epic fantasy, which I did a ton of research on early medieval Europe. And I discovered so many things I had no clue about that just blew me away. And some, maybe too many of which I tried to shoehorn into the story because
Me too.
but exactly, because it's amazing. Because I don't know. I mean, the story is the story, but the world to me is also the story. That's why I love world building so much.
I agree. I think I love world building too. I feel like historical fiction, honestly, is very close to fantasy. It's so close. I mean, and science fiction as well, but in a different way. But fantasy and historical fiction, like, isn't there that saying, like, the past is a different country?
The past is a foreign country. Yeah.
The past is a foreign country, right?
Don't ask me why I know that, because I haven't memorized. It's burned into my brain. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is literally building a fictional world for your reader. And it's very important to, well, I think it's important to make that world realistic. And I can only do that through research.
Research. Well, and then also we're lucky too, because it's not that say the past wasn't known, but that it was so hard to find things before. It's more possible to find things now, like with the explosion of research in the 70s and 80s where it just expanded who was going into various fields, expanded what they wanted to talk about, what they wanted to publish. There's so much more information now. When I wrote, here's another example, when I wrote Crown of Stars, one of the important texts from 10th, there's a monk named Widukind who was at the monastery in Corvey. And he wrote a history called, it's often called The Deeds of the Saxons, but it focuses on Henry and Otto the Great, his son Otto the Great. And it's considered one of the best sources for, because he lived at that time and he either, I don't know if he knew them, but he was around that whole thing. So I knew that was there. And I tracked down, so I wrote this in the 90s, or much of it in the 90s. Someone in like the 40s had, as their dissertation, translated it. I tracked down a microfiche and paid some astronomical sum to get a printed version of it, which I still have. Today, you can buy a typeset new translation by eminent scholars that was just done like 5 or 6 years ago, you know. So there's a lot of stuff available now that it wasn't available 30 years ago. So this is a golden age for research.
Yeah, and as archives become digitized, you don't even have to travel to them. Like, that's amazing.
Yes. Oh, I wish I had even thought, because I know there's stuff I've found on archives. Oh, yeah, we can both name things we've seen online, only online, that we wouldn't have had access to.
Yeah.
Even 10 years ago, I don't know.
It's amazing, the internet. The internet is amazing. I mean, it's often terrible, but it is also amazing for research. Yeah. And the problem is, of course, you can then spend, you know, all your time going down internet research rabbit holes, convincing yourself that it's relevant.
It is relevant. Actually, there's a couple of things I want to bounce off that very statement. But I want to start with, how do you protect yourself against bad information and bad research?
Oh, well, this is something I learned in grad school. I try to figure out who wrote the thing I'm reading, the article or the book, and I try to figure out what other people in that field think of this person. Because scholars have reputations, and sometimes you can't tell what other people think of them. But if you become well-versed in the subject that you're researching, you start to see people referring to each other in their citations, and you can kind of glean from those footnotes or those acknowledgements or those introductions what people think about each other. This is also where it's good to read, like, what do they call that? A survey, like a literature survey. Some like academic journals, they have like literature surveys that wrap up like the last 10 years of critical theory about, I don't know, Viking like warriors. You know what I mean? Sometimes there will be a literature survey somewhere that you can find in the introduction of a book or in a journal, and then they'll go through the most influential scholarship, and you can see if the people you're reading are in that or not. It's impossible to really know whether something is accurate, but I like to get an idea of what the field thinks of that theory or that person, so that I can decide whether I want to use that in a straightforward way or not.
I want to briefly jump back to what you said of the very, very basic research. You know, that Wikipedia and places like that, they are okay for basics. To get like, I want to open the window and see what the ground looks like out there. But in general, I would, with some exceptions, and I don't know what they are, I would be hesitant about using them as your main source if you're trying to.
It's a great place to start, and you can you know what I start with Wikipedia is I kind of skim the stuff, and then I go to the footnotes and read the sources that are footnoted. Yeah, that's what I tend to do if I'm really interested in that subject.
Yeah, and then and another thing, especially doing historical research, is discovering where archives are, where people have. So for example, the Studs Terkel interviews, he did a whole series of what we would now call podcasts, but which were probably radio interviews. And you can find a lot of those online where he's just talking with different people. I'm sure that he did those, a couple of famous volumes where he talked just to World War II veterans, people who had lived through the war, and I think Great Depression ones too, where he just talked to ordinary people to get what they had experienced. And again, there's books on those, but there's probably also archives. There's probably someone who has done archival research and who has there's probably somewhere where you can find, if you know medieval High German, you can probably find,
if you know it. Oh yeah, I know that.
Documents, right?
Right.
I found the documents. Yeah.
That's what is amazing to know, is that someone has probably looked into this obscure subject that you're interested in. Like, just because you don't know anything about it yet at the beginning does not mean that no one knows anything about it. Like, someone somewhere, some graduate student somewhere wrote their dissertation in the 1940s about this thing. And because of the proliferation of online databases, you can find that person now. You can find that dissertation. It's really amazing.
Well, and also as people as scholars mine the most obvious research subjects and the flashy, sexy research subjects, then people start digging into places that were considered unimportant, maybe merchant contracts in 13th century Brussels, right? Where you may suddenly find a bunch of women were engaging in trade on their own behalf. So, after being told that women didn't do that, right? But now someone's digging into that. And,
that sounds interesting to me. I'm like, where's that paper?
I have, it's out there. It's out there. Right there. So I want to get back to this idea of questions, because I find this crucial. This idea that I'm often in that situation where someone I'll be, sitting and people say, do you have any questions? And I will think to myself, I don't have any questions because I don't know enough yet to have a question. Can you talk about this balance between saying the general questions which you can answer yourself and what a specific question means in the context of world building? Does that make sense, what I asked?
Yes, there are some specific questions that come up when you're writing that you can quickly Google. And then there are some questions that you cannot Google. And I think that when you find a question that you cannot Google, that's something to pay attention to. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, honestly.
Okay,
but
okay.
I do feel like there's a certain type of question that requires going beyond the archive and beyond the internet. And that's the type of question that you will only know is that type of question once you've done a lot of internet and archival research. Because when you get to know the lay of the land of whatever you're researching, experts in that field will, it'll be clear they don't have the answer to that question, or there's no research on it. It will become clear if you are as I guess over obsessed with research as someone like me.
Well, there's a level of familiarity with a subject matter. I wish I should have come up with an example, which I can't come up with offhand, but there is that thing with world building where I can write, I'm using Court of Fives a lot because it's an easy one for me to use, where I can use the regular questions, or I can say, help me, Melinda, help me. What am I trying to say? There's a kind of a question that you really have to know your material before you even know that. And I'm not sure how to phrase that. Maybe that's the only way I can phrase it.
I know what you mean though, because people are, it's a confusing thing to say there are questions you cannot ask until you know enough. Like that's a confusing thing to say, but I think it is true. And I'm not sure that there's a way to explain it, because right now I'm researching something totally different. I'm learning about right now I'm learning about contemporary art and artists, and I know nothing about contemporary art and artists. Like I've actually taken an online history of art class. I did this last year to kind of get like 101 level knowledge of art. And then I realized what I need to know is not how theorists think of art. I
Yeah.
need to know how artists think of art
Yeah.
and how they do make their art. And like, so in order to, and I feel that there will be more questions for me to have. And I feel that I will need to speak to a working artist. But before I do that, what I'm doing is I have subscribed to Art News, which is it's a news website, and they send daily news reports about art news. And they have links to so many interesting things about like archaeology and repatriation of stolen artifacts, but also artists who are exhibiting their work and making statements about their art. And so then I go and look at these artists' websites and their exhibitions online, and I see what they're saying, and I follow the links to an instinctive way. And I feel that I am zeroing in on what I will need to
Yeah.
ask an actual artist
Yeah.
by knowing what other artists have said about their work, or what kind of art is considered, what kind of stuff is considered art today. I mean, I just feel like it's detective work in a way for your own imagination,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
right? Like you're
Well, I mean,
investigating what you want to know.
knowledge is itself a skill in that way, right? If I took Shotokan karate, which I did back in the day, or if I took piano lessons, which I did back in the day, people wouldn't give me, a Debussy prelude to play for my first piece. You have to work your way up to, and knowledge is the same way. You work your way up. It's not just like something, and in fact, that's one of my biggest issues with a modern conception of knowledge, which I see is if it's something fixed that can just be dropped on you. It isn't.
Right.
It's a process itself, and it's a great process. I think it's I think it's one of the most human processes actually of all, just curiosity, creativity, and putting things together.
Yeah.
I knew you would answer that question in a way that would be helpful to me.
Good. I hope it was. I think I think it's pretty funny that I end up often falling back on mystery and detective novel metaphors, because I do really now think of it as an investigation of what you want to know. Like you need to continue following the clues until you have reached a point where you have a solution in mind, and and then you can, then that question will emerge, I think.
And I think there are writers who simply aren't interested in this process. They
Oh,
what they
sure.
want to write about is different, and that's fine.
Not everyone is as obsessed with this as me as you.
It's great. Like, wait, it's like, oh my gosh, I found online carpentry tools of the 1830s.
I'm immediately like, I want to see those.
I know. I printed it out. It was amazing. All right, we have a couple of questions. Jennifer asks, Melinda, could you speak to the issue of using someone as inspiration from history for a character? For example, I'm developing a character based on Hazel Lee, who was one of the first Chinese pilots, in some ways, with a similar historical experience and accomplishments, but in no way based on her personality, family personality. Are there ways? Oh, this is an interesting question. Are there ways to avoid infringing on a personal history when doing this kind of historical fantasy?
Wow. Yeah.
I think that's a.
You seem to have a beat on this answer.
No, I don't.
No.
You mean me personally?
Yeah.
I think asking that question is a good start.
Yeah,
Um,
I think what I would want to do is know a lot more about the person and see where my story, where I would want to diverge from their life. Um, because I also think that at the beginning, a book feels like one thing, and the more you work on it, the more it becomes something else. Um,
yeah.
through revision, it becomes its own thing. And what you think it is at the beginning is not necessarily what it is at the end. So even if you start with Hazel Lee, I think her name was, even if you start with Hazel Lee as a model or an inspiration, if you really inhabit your story and tell the story that you want to tell about this character who is inspired by a real life person, by the time you get to the end of the process, that character will not be Hazel Lee. If you have really inhabited that character, that's what I think. I know that I have thought about this myself because I'm hoping at some point to write a novel based on the life of a family member of mine. And I am concerned about this, but I also believe that as the story evolves, it will become itself. And just as writers put real people in their books sometimes to begin with, as the story evolves, the characters change and they become themselves and are no longer the person they were inspired upon, inspired by,
Bye
I
bye.
think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that sound right to you?
That sounds exactly right to me.
Okay.
Because if it is just a thinly veiled, then it means that the writer isn't moving past saying, oh, this is a cool story, let
Right.
me retell it. And there's also places in which people are basically retelling someone's story
Hmm.
together. But and it's a little different because this is a 20th century story. So it's a little closer to us still.
Right.
If you
Right.
jump back 2000 years and you
Then
do
it's fine.
Alexander the Great, who cares, right? I
Exactly.
don't.
The
I
longer they
don't.
have been gone from the world, the
Yeah.
less important this is.
Yeah.
So if they were recently alive, or if they're still alive, obviously then you should get their permission. If they were recently alive, then it's interesting to see how active their family is and their legacy, and you might want to judge for yourself how close your story is to their real life and whether their family should be asked for permission, or not. I think that I would probably veer away from doing a story that was based on someone who had been alive recently, whose family was invested in their legacy. I would just not want to do that. But I don't know much about Hazel Lee, so there you have it.
All right, I'm going to move on to Kelsey. Do you have a preferred method of note taking to make your research searchable later on?
Oh God.
Oh my God. How do you organize your notes? I know I had that somewhere in these 100 pages.
I tried to use Evernote, and then they had a privacy problem like 5 years ago. So then I like moved to OneNote. And so now my notes are half on Evernote and half on OneNote. And I don't even look at Evernote anymore. So I've lost a lot of notes. And
Oh.
I do use OneNote now. It's searchable. It's not the best, also because I'm using a Mac, and it's not the best. I've tried databases, um, and I've started using this thing called Tropy, I think, Tropy, which is a way to organize visual references. So because now I have a lot of photos of art, so I'm importing them into Tropy, which is a photo database, and you can then tag them and write little notes on each photo and put them in folders if you want. Um, I I don't know how good any of this is. I don't know if it's any better than writing them in a notebook because I also have notebooks. So
I
it's a lot of stuff, and it's just a lot of stuff. I wish there was a superior note-taking methodology or something. I have not discovered it yet.
you
Uh,
know, I do the bad notebook and then I can't find it later. thing. My only recommendation would be to see what is search graduate programs, or what's the rag, higher education, the bulletin of higher education.
The Chronicle of Higher
The
Education?
Chronicle of Education, thank you.
Yeah.
Search maybe them and see if they have anything about these are recommendations for note taking, for, because every grad student is taking notes on something. And they might have ideas. That would be the research way of going about it, right? Research
How to do research better?
Research how to do research better. Find a book. There's got to be books out there. Someone has written a book.
Yeah, you can, there's endless numbers of database and note-taking apps. It's just a lot to think about. And yeah.
It's an excellent question that we haven't done enough research on.
No, we don't know how to answer it properly.
All right, Leslie asks, oh, we're going to love this one. Could either of you speak to how your world's ecosystem shapes your characters? That's a whole hour.
Next week.
Next week on cultural ecology. All right, I'm writing that down. The short version, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. So back in the day, in the 20th century, now historical fiction, the archaeology and anthropology came up with this term called cultural ecology, which is basically, and Melinda will correct me if I get it wrong, which is basically saying that the relationship between people and their environment and the kind of cultural the kind of culture they develop in any given environmental system will be based in large part on their relationship to that environment and what is available to them in that environment. So people who live in the mountains aren't going to have a complex set of words for fish you can catch in the ocean. And if you do, then you're not thinking about it. In the same way, people at the ocean are maybe not going to have a complex set of words about different kinds of storms in the desert if they don't have a desert, if the desert is 2,000 miles away. Do you want to add to that?
Well, if I can riff off this language thing, which I think is a good way to think about it, because in Last Night of the Telegraph Club, when the book begins, Lily finds an ad for a nightclub called the Telegraph Club, and it's advertising a male impersonator, which is what we would call drag kings today. So Lily is discovering in this book that she is a lesbian, but she doesn't know how to talk about that. Like, her cultural ecology does not include any language for being queer. None whatsoever. So she has to figure this out with no words for it. And so that is something that I tried to explore in the book through what she does, which is she feels a connection to this nightclub with its male impersonator. It feels queer to her, although she doesn't know the word queer except as a slur. But it feels like something she is drawn to. She has also collected photos of women who strike her as unusual. It's something she wants to look at, and she doesn't know why. So this is something that she is feeling in her body, but she has no words for it. So the book is her developing a language for these emotions, and I think that's one way that cultural ecology affects the characters in my most recent book. And I mean, you can also talk about how it affects readers, because I knew in writing this book that readers most likely would not speak Chinese or would not know how to write Chinese. And so I had a choice about how to present Lily's Chinese speaking, because she's Chinese American, she speaks Chinese. I had to make decisions about how to express that to readers who are only English language readers, knowing that their cultural system does not include knowing how to read Chinese characters. And there's a way, but at the same time, I didn't want to make that difference invisible. I wanted to make it clear that she was speaking in a different language to readers who couldn't read that language. So it that language thing is kind of a way of well, not mirroring, but it's another way, you know, of recognizing that we don't all have the same cultural ecology, I guess. And I
Yeah.
made an attempt to recognize that and to use it in a way, um, in the reader relationship. But the queer thing is more obviously an answer to
Yeah.
your question.
Yeah, and we're running. Okay, we're gonna do this fast. I want to add one thing to that because I agree with everything you said. Of course, in terms of material culture and social structures, ecosystems will have a huge effect on how people, you know, whether you're going to have a bunch of horse riders or whether people will be boats. You know, the outrigger canoe developed in the Pacific for specific reasons, and that's why the outrigger canoe, which has that float on the edge, is for the wave action. Well, that, but then in other places, boats don't have that. So why did it develop here and not there? So those are all questions that are important. And you know what, maybe I've written that down, that I'll maybe do a whole hour next season on cultural ecology. So there's one quick question, which is actually a huge question. And a great
Quick, but
question.
huge.
Avi, quick, yeah. But how do you use real world research to write fantasy stories?
Ah, that's
The same
fun.
way, the same
The same
way.
way. Yeah, the same way. I just wrote a short story that is a fairy tale retelling, and which somehow meant I had to do a lot of research into 17th century New England and witchcraft. Like I already knew some stuff about the history of witchcraft because, of course, as a grad student, I took a course on the history of witchcraft, and so I still had those books. But you know, I was writing a fairy tale retelling. There was going to be a witch in it, and so I wanted to read about how New Englanders in the 1600s thought of witches, you know, and what I have did in that case, and actually what I did in Huntress as well when I was researching Taoism as a, you know, you take what people say they believe and you make it real. I could make it real in fantasy. This is a pretty direct way to do this.
Yeah.
But in
Yeah.
the real world, like there's no magic, I don't think. But in a fantasy world, there can be. But in the real world, there are so many beliefs about magic and how magic works, how it doesn't work, who has it, who doesn't have it. There are so many of these beliefs in the real world. So what is fun for me is to take those real world beliefs and make them literally real in a fantasy setting.
And I also think that fantasy worlds are often, unless you're doing something really different with the physics or very, very wild with the ecosystem, that the fantasy worlds are generally based on an understood mode of physical, geographical, geological processes, right? Biological processes. And all the research you do about the real world helps feed that. I mean, everything that you know helps create a foundation for you to write something that feels that when your reader enters the story, they feel like they're walking on real ground, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's why and actually we are about out of time. Do you have any last words of wisdom? I love putting people on the spot with that question.
Last words of wisdom. Do I have any? I just have to say, I want people, I mean, probably everyone here knows this, but I really think if you want to do research into a subject, really get to know your public library and its website. I mean, people seem to forget all the time that their public library has so many of these databases available right at your fingertips from your home for free. Like, you don't need an academic research library you know, you don't need one. You can really do so much from your public library. And so I try to tell writers that, because not everyone has access to a research library, but you have your public library.
All right. I want to thank everybody who joined us. We got all the questions answered. And this is the last episode of what I'm calling season 1 for no reason other than I just like to call it season 1. There will be a hiatus for 3 to 4 months, and then I am planning on doing a season 2 starting in October. So again, if you're
Cultural
watching
ecology.
Cultural Ecology, that will be one of the ones. I'm going to do some political stuff too. So I want to again thank SFWA for allowing this platform to happen. I want to thank Nathan, who's been facilitating, who has facilitated all of these episodes so far. All of you who showed up for the live video, and any of you who are watching this YouTube recording. And especially I want to thank you, Melinda, for joining me today.